Welcome. We are delighted to have a chance to present this evening the new book of Harvey Sachs, Toscanini, Musician of Consciousness. As you can tell, it's opus magnus, about 900 pages of a book. It's an impressive work of research and scholarship that went into this book, that because of my friendship with Harvey, I've been following, especially in the last few years, and I've been waited for anxiously. And the arrival didn't disappoint me a bit. It's a great way of diving not only into the figure of the most prominent music conductor of the 20th century, one that reshaped the very figure and the role of the conductor, but also of a great Italian. And many of us might know bits and pieces of his biography, and reading Harvey's book, it confirms everything that I felt towards Toscanini and gave me a great wealth of other things that I completely ignored. So for what he did in his book, I think we all owe him a great debt of gratitude. And Harvey Sachs, as I mentioned, is a music historian. He's the author or co-author of 10 books, 3 of which I believe on Toscanini, including a previous biography that has nothing to do with this one. This is not a rewriting of that. It's a completely new book. I think Harvey digged archives and libraries and listened to recordings for the past, how many years, Harvey?
60, 70.
So, and you really see it from every little piece of information in here that it's a result of a great work of scholarship, and at the same time he manages to keep it fascinating and really gripping. He writes frequently for The New Yorker, The New York Times, and the Time Literary Supplement. And he is on the faculty of the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. And we also have the fortune of having a presenter here with us this evening. It's Professor Jonathan Rosenberg. He's a professor of 20th century US history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I just quote one of his previous books, that is How Far the Promised Land, World Affairs and the American Civil Rights Movement from the First War to Vietnam, published with Princeton University Press in 2006. But what I find fascinating and particularly fitting with the topic we are discussing tonight, that is Toscanini, is his upcoming book about to be published, that is called Dangerous Melodies and Diplomatic Instruments, When Classical Music Mattered in America. And it's forthcoming with W. Norton. So we have a great panel, and again, I'm very excited about this evening and about talking with you about this book, and it's with great, great pleasure that I introduce you the author, Harvey Sachs.
Thank you very much. I'll lower this a little because Stefano is much taller than I am. There are a few untaken seats here so far, so for some of you who are standing, I think you're allowed to occupy the seats now. I want to begin by thanking, of course, Stefano Albertini, the director of Casa Italiana, and also Kostya Kostic, who is one of the administrators here, and my son, Julian Sachs, who organizes the events here. This is not a case of nepotism. The idea didn't start with him, and I just want you to know that, okay? I also want to make a few other acknowledgments and thank-yous. I would like to mention my literary agent, Denise Shannon, who is here and went through all the suffering connected with the publication of this book. Also, Bob Weil, my editor at W.W. Norton Liveright, who I think will arrive later. this evening, and other people who worked with him at Liveright on this publication, Marie Pantojan, Cordelia Calvert, and many of their colleagues. I want to thank my partner Eve Wolf, who encouraged me from the very beginning on this project. And this is not a case, you know, there's the old joke about the dedication in the book where the author says, I wish to thank my husband or wife or whatever, without whose help and encouragement this book would have been finished 2 years earlier. That's definitely not the case here. Eve's advice helped me all the way through, and really it was her encouragement together with that of dear friend Valfredo Toscanini, who got me to do this new biography, which is out now almost 40 years after the old biography that I wrote. So I can't claim that I'm only 39 years old. Valfredo encouraged this right from the beginning. He wanted me to write a new biography of his grandfather because when I wrote the one that came out in 1978, the archives, most of the archives were not available at that time. I had the advantage then that there were still many people alive who had worked with Toscanini, or family members, friends, and I was living in Milan when most of the work on the book was done, so it was, you know, very convenient to be able to talk to a lot of people who had worked directly with him. But at that time, the Toscanini family's archives were out of bounds, and so were La Scala's archives and the Ricordi Publishing Company's archives and so on. So all of that had to wait for a long time, and when all of this material finally became available, mostly in the 1990s and in the first years of the new century, that's when I decided to proceed with this. I also owe a great thank you to the National Endowment for the Humanities, which made the work on this book possible. Again, Emanuela Castelbarco, Toscanini's granddaughter, who is still alive, lives in Italy. Her material helped me greatly with this. And Valfredo's daughters, Liana and Chia, who are here this evening, and you will have a chance to meet them later. Two of Toscanini's 4 great-grandchildren also helped me very, very much in my work on the book. As did Alan Steckler, the Toscanini family's manager, who unfortunately is not well and couldn't be here this evening, but he was encouraging right from the start. Now, I want to read, I don't want to bore you, but I want to read a few excerpts from the book, and I've chosen excerpts from 3 different periods in Toscanini's life. I'm not going to read the whole book. It's, 944 pages. Emanuela, his granddaughter, told me this summer that she read it in 2 days. Now, I don't know if she drinks a lot of coffee or what, but I couldn't read it in 2 days. That I know. Anyway, she may have skimmed here and there. I want to read, first of all, a passage from the very beginning of Toscanini's career. Now, anybody who knows anything about Toscanini knows that he made his debut when he was 19 years old, replacing a conductor at the last minute during a tour that an itinerant Italian opera company was giving in South America, specifically in Rio de Janeiro. And he was actually principal cello and assistant chorus master with this company. He had just graduated from the conservatory in his hometown, Parma, the year before. Everybody knew that he was a very talented kid. He was, at the last minute, asked to replace the conductor who had just quit, and he conducted a performance of Aida entirely from memory. And then, because the conductor quit for good, he took over the rest of the tour. He rehearsed, which is much harder than actually conducting a performance, he rehearsed and conducted 12 operas entirely from memory in the course of this tour. So then he came back to Italy when the tour was over and figured he would start playing the cello again. So this is the passage that I think may interest you. If a 19-year-old musician were to do today what Toscanini did in Rio de Janeiro in 1886, there would be an enormous amount of international fuss and publicity. But Toscanini returned to Genoa, which is where his parents lived at the time. They had moved there from Parma. He returned to Genoa in mid-September, greeted his family, gave his mother whatever remained of his earnings, and prepared to return to anonymity. I started to play the cello again, he said many years later. I didn't feel important enough to think of myself as a conductor yet. The Rossi Ensemble, that was the ensemble that had performed in South America, the Rossi Ensemble's lead tenor, Nikolai Figner, who was a Russian, thought otherwise. Figner had studied many operas with me, Toscanini recalled, even Russian operas like Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin, which, by the way, was only 7 years old at the time and had never been performed in Italy. When I didn't show up in Milan, which was the hub of Italian musical life, Figner wrote to him, "What are you doing playing the cello after what you've done?" But what was I supposed to do? Go around telling people I was a conductor? I was 19 years old and looked even younger than my age. And whom was I supposed to tell? But then he called me to Milan, gave me the money I needed, and put me up at the Hotel San Michele. Figner and his fiancée, Medea May, who had also sung in the company, she was a Florentine mezzo-soprano switching to soprano roles, had Toscanini accompany them when they auditioned at La Scala for the celebrated conductor Franco Faccio, the powerful music publisher Giulio Ricordi, and the well-known librettist, impresario, and critic Carlo Dormeville. Neither singer was engaged, but Toscanini had set foot for the first time in Italy's most famous lyric theater. Figner then introduced Toscanini to various agents and to another important publisher, the 72-year-old Giovannina Lucca. Italian music publishers were omnipotent in those days when opera was a lucrative business. They controlled the rights to the operas they published, and they often decided who would perform important productions of those works. Signora Lucca had a beautiful villa above Cernobbio and Lake Como, and she invited us to lunch, Toscanini said. There, Figner began to extol my abilities, to talk about what I had done in South America. The tenor asked the publisher whether she knew of a possible opening for the young maestro. There could be a theater, Turin, she said to Toscanini. They want to do The Flying Dutchman and Catalani's Edmea this autumn. Figner was already under contract to sing in the Turin premiere of Edmea, the latest opera by the 32-year-old Alfredo Catalani, an up-and-coming composer, and Signora Lucca held the rights to the work, which had had its world premiere at La Scala the preceding February. There was nothing unusual at the time for a new production of a significant new opera to be organized at a major venue virtually at the last moment, since staging and sets were simple. Toscanini had returned to Italy from Brazil not earlier than mid-September, and his encounter with Signora Lucca cannot have taken place before early October, barely a month before Edmea was to be performed in Turin. Toscanini did not know Edmea, but Figner assured her that the young man could conduct it. And he hit on a trick, as Toscanini recalled. This is a quote. "One morning I was in bed, and Figner called my room to say, 'Come over immediately. They've sent me the score of Edmea. Let's start to study it.' There, in a ground floor room of the nearby Hotel Leone, I started to play, and on I went. I used to sight read very well." He's telling this story at the age of 88, okay? "I got to the finale of the second act. It was a grandiose finale along the lines of that of the third act of La Gioconda, and I was sweating. and someone came up to me looking at me through a monocle. He was following the score. It was the impresario from Turin, Giovanni de Panis. When I had finished the second act, he said, "You must have known this opera already." "No," I said, "I didn't know it. It just came this morning, and I'm reading it for the first time." Then he turned and motioned to another man to come forward. It was Catalani, and Catalani had been listening to me play. So on the basis of this unorthodox audition, Toscanini was engaged for Turin's Teatro Carignano. And I won't continue with this part of the excerpt. What I want to quote, the last part from this, is when he starts rehearsing the orchestra. I was rehearsing the opera. He laughed as he told the story. And there's a point in the first act, a short cello solo. The principal cello was out of tune, and I asked the musician, "Let's do it again." I repeated the same phrase 2 or 3 times. He said, "Do we have to go on like this?" "Sir, until you play in tune." "Am I out of tune?" "Yes." "Get yourself another first cello." And he left. So when I think about it now, I tell myself that I did have some authority. So this is this 19-year-old, and he tells also in one of the conversation tapes, which I'm going to describe in a moment, that when in these early years, he was actually a rather shy person. He developed his famous terrible temper because he wanted things to go the way he wanted them to go. But he was basically a shy person. And he said when he would come into a new theater in one of the provincial towns where he conducted in his early years, he would go and sit at the piano so that they would know that he was the conductor, because he was so much younger than everybody else. He really needed to be able to somehow or other impose a kind of authority that would enable him to put a performance together. Now, I mentioned just now the conversation tapes. One of the major sources that became available to me that made the writing of this book possible and in a sense necessary was the existence of about 121 tapes that were made unbeknownst to Toscanini during his last years. What happened was this. His son, Walter, in his father's later years as a conductor, realized that his powers were beginning to diminish, and he wanted to do as much as he could to preserve as much as was possible of his father's work. So he set up a recording studio in the family house here in Riverdale, and he, with the help of some hi-fi enthusiasts, who, by the way, included the author Ralph Ellison, who was about to burst on the scene with Invisible Man. He was a big hi-fi enthusiast and jazz and classical music enthusiast. Anyway, they helped Walter to set up a sort of hi-fi system in the house, and so that Toscanini could listen to playbacks of his recordings without having to be dragged into Manhattan every time that he needed to hear one of them. And Walter Toscanini at that point also installed, he put a microphone on the stand of a lamp, a floor lamp, next to the chair where Toscanini used to sit, so that the maestro could communicate with the sound engineers or with Walter himself in the basement and explain, what he wanted. Was this take good? Was that take bad? Whatever. At a certain point, Walter thought to himself, my father refuses to write a memoir, to write anything about his life, and he won't allow a biographer to interview him in any systematic way. I'd like to get as many details of his life down as possible. And he noticed that when friends would come over for dinner or whatever, Toscanini was very easily drawn out. They would ask him questions: what happened on such and such an occasion, what was such and such a singer like, and so on. And he would speak very freely. So Walter got in the habit of pressing the record button on the tape recorder when people came over. And that's how these tapes came into existence. I want to play for you just 2 minutes of one of the tapes, which most of it, I would say 98% of the tapes are in Italian. But occasionally when people were over who didn't speak Italian, Toscanini would speak to them in English. And I just want to, because the tape isn't perfect and his English isn't perfect, I want to explain what you're going to hear. So Toscanini is talking, they asked him about his cello playing as a student. And he tells them, my teacher was very happy. You play very well, he said. No, I play badly. I cannot play this piece. I changed the piece. So for his exam, he's talking about his final cello exam. He was supposed to play a piece by Boccherini. And he says, I was young. I say to myself, I say inside, which means to myself, I have to play in this way with the cello. At the last moment, I had the examen, he says. I said, Maestro, I can't play this piece. Ma, you play wonderfully. No, I play badly, and I changed the piece. At the last moment, I changed. In other words, he's saying, I was just as self-critical when I was 18 years old as I am now. And he talks about playing the cello, and one of the engineers, you'll hear the voice of Samuel Schatzonoff, who asks him what piece he played. Schatzonoff was the manager of the NBC Symphony Orchestra, himself a pianist who early in his life had accompanied Jascha Heifetz and other string players in their recitals. Anyway, listen for a couple minutes to Toscanini at the age of 86 talking about his student days.
My teacher was very happy. You play very well. I said, no, I play badly. I cannot play this piece. I changed the piece. Yes, I changed. I had to play a sonata of Boccherini. I was young. I sang inside. I said, I have to play in this way, with the cello. At the last moment, I had the exam. I said, Maestro, I can play this piece. Oh, you play wonderfully. No, I play badly. And I changed the piece. At the last moment, I changed.
What did you play?
I played un pezzo di a Russian piece.
Ah, yes.
The variation good. But to play the first bar, I could not play. I could sing, but play, no. I was the same like today, the same.
How long since you played any cello?
I played cello, no, I left the orchestra at 19 when I started to conduct Aida, and I played cello when Verdi gave Otello. Allora I went in orchestra because I never saw Verdi, and I played Otello with Verdi. And then I played cello for many years. I played in quartets or so. But I left cello. Now I can only see, but I cannot play one note now. No. I played all strings, violin, I played contrabasso, yes. But
You played contrabasso?
yes.
No, no.
Oh yes.
Yeah?
It's not difficult.
Violin too? Studied violin?
No, I like it more violin than cello.
But you studied,
I
no?
don't know. No, I did not study. I studied for myself.
Very difficult.
Well, you know,
More so than cello.
I like it better
Yeah, go on.
violin than cello. Cello is very difficult.
Very difficult.
Very difficult cello.
Okay, so I don't know whether you got all of that, but he talks about how he stopped playing the cello professionally in the orchestra, but he went to La Scala before his 20th birthday and got a job as second cello in the Scala Orchestra for the world premiere of Verdi's Otello, because he had never seen Verdi and he wanted to work with Verdi. Verdi didn't conduct the opera, he supervised the production, all the elements of it. And so that was his last orchestral job as a cellist. But then he says how he continued to play the cello not performing professionally, but he would play string quartets with other musicians and so on for a few years. But then he says, I haven't played for many years, now I can only sing, I can't play. So that's the kind of material I was working with. That's one of the better quality tapes. Many of them, you know, he would get up and move during a conversation, and you'd hear other people talking, so it was very hard to decipher a lot of the material. The second little excerpt I'd like to read is from Toscanini's debut in the United States, in New York specifically. I thought that might be appropriate here. Toscanini, at the age of 41, had already spent 7 years as what we would today call both music director and artistic director of La Scala in Milan. He was certainly the most famous of Italian conductors and a world-famous conductor already. And he came to New York as more or less co-principal conductor of the Metropolitan Opera with Gustav Mahler. So you can imagine, I think I say somewhere in the book, I don't think any opera company in the world before, during, or since has had two conductors of that stature simultaneously. So I wanted to read a little bit about his first approach to the orchestra and the company. Of course, this was the old Met at Broadway and 34th Street. Years later, Toscanini told Bruno Walter that he was so nervous before his first rehearsal with the Metropolitan Orchestra that he had considered canceling his engagement altogether. Much of his apprehensiveness must have been related to language. Even in Argentina, he had worked with orchestra musicians who spoke, or at least understood, Italian, whereas most of the New York Orchestra's musicians were native German, Russian, or Yiddish speakers who also spoke English to varying degrees. Now, he had just been starting to learn English. Toscanini had never yet conducted an opera in any language other than Italian, because in those days, although he conducted German, French, everything, Russian operas, in Italy, they were all performed in Italian, just as all French and Italian operas were performed in German in Germany, and so on and so forth. They were always performed in the local language. But at the Metropolitan, each Italian, German, and French opera was performed in its original language. Memorizing French and German texts caused him little trouble because he had a photographic memory, but he could not hone singers' pronunciation and enunciation in those languages as he could in Italian. Toscanini boldly chose the prologue and Act 1 of Götterdämmerung for his first orchestral rehearsal on 19 October 1908. He had uncharacteristically written out a little greeting in English in the same notebook that contained his English language exercises. Someone read it to the musicians on his behalf. "Gentlemen," it said, of course there were no women in orchestras in those days, "I am very pleased at having the honor to conduct the orchestra of the Metropolitan Opera House. But I am sorry that I do not speak either English or German to express myself as I would wish," which he wrote W-H-I-S-H. "Nevertheless, I do not doubt that as music has a universal language, we shall understand each other very well." The players had heard stories about Toscanini's memory, but there was general astonishment when he began to rehearse Wagner's gigantic work in detail without consulting the score. And the astonishment grew as the new conductor began to hear and correct errors in the musicians' printed parts that well-known German conductors had never detected. Still more impressive was the way in which he immersed his co-workers in the very substance of the music. At one point, the orchestra spontaneously broke into applause, bravos, and a fanfare. The New York Post interviewed one of the musicians who exclaimed, "Why, it is simply beyond understanding the way he knows his scores. We have often heard conductors direct without notes, but when it comes to knowing every mark and every instrument, to make every correction in expression as well as in everything else without once referring to the music, it shows an intimacy with the work and a self-confidence as inspiring as it is remarkable." The musicians were also surprised that Toscanini did not sit at rehearsals. He conducts on his feet and is the first man in charge of an orchestra here to do that since the days of Anton Seidel, the Sun reported. The first rehearsal lasted for more than 4 hours, but the players were not too fatigued at the end of that period to give the new conductor another fanfare. Toscanini, even in old age, described the orchestra players as magnificent. And Gatti, that's Giulio Gatti Casazza, who was the general manager of the Metropolitan Opera, he came to the Met together with Toscanini, but Toscanini stayed 7 seasons and Gatti stayed 27 seasons at the Met. Gatti reported that after a few rehearsals they understood his ideas exactly, although these ideas were new to them. He got along excellently from the start. Toscanini made his North American debut and opened the Metropolitan Opera House's season on 16 November 1908, conducting Aida with an all-star cast that included the Czech soprano Emmy Destin, making her American debut in the title role, Caruso as Radames, the American mezzo-soprano Louise Homer as Amneris, Antonio Scotti as Amonasro, and the Polish basso Adamo Didur as Ramfis. The theater was practically in a state of siege from 7:30 last night until an hour and a half later, when the last of the unfortunates who hadn't got tickets in advance reluctantly abandoned their efforts to obtain admission, the Sun reported the next day. There were 4,000 persons inside the opera house by the time the curtain fell on the first act, etc., etc. Toscanini also in the conversation tapes talks at length about his work at the Met, and he mentions, there's a very funny story, he talks about Mahler, whom he praises as a conductor, even though he didn't like his music. And he mentions that Mahler was so pleased with the way the orchestra played the Bartered Bride overture, the Smetana Bartered Bride. The audiences used to arrive late, especially the wealthy members of the Metropolitan audience would arrive in time for the second act. Mahler wanted them to hear the overture, so instead of playing it before the first act, he played it before the second act. Anyway, so that's that little episode. If you'll allow me, I'll do one more. And this is from much later in Toscanini's life and on a totally different subject. We're in 1938 now. Toscanini is 71 years old, and he's at the end of his first season with the NBC Symphony Orchestra, which was created, a radio orchestra created for him by David Sarnoff, the chairman of the board of RCA. He was, at that point, by far the most famous conductor in the world. He had spent a decade conducting the Scala Ensemble, again in the 1920s. He had been principal conductor of the New York Philharmonic for a decade as well. He had conducted at the Bayreuth Festival in Germany. He was the first non-German school conductor to perform at the Wagner Festival, but he had quit when Hitler came to power in 1933. Now in 34, 35, 36, 37, he conducted each summer at the Salzburg Festival in Austria. And he was the center of attraction there. Their ticket sales went up from 58% to 89% the first year he was there, and his performances sold out. So he was very important to the people who ran the Salzburg Festival. But at the beginning of 1938, there was, of course, a crisis. Toscanini at this point had had many years of experience, 16 years of experience with the fascists in Italy. And since 1931, when he had been physically attacked by fascist thugs in Bologna, he had made up his mind not to conduct again in Italy as long as Mussolini's regime was in power. So here we are in 1938. He had planned to conduct a benefit concert with the NBC Symphony in New York to raise money for the new theater that was being built for the Salzburg Festival. And on the 12th of February, Chancellor Schuschnigg of Austria met with Hitler and bowed to some of Hitler's demands, including the aligning of Austrian foreign and economic policies with those of Germany, and the installation of Arturo Toscanini, a leading Austrian Nazi, as Minister of the Interior, thus head of the National Police Force. So Toscanini received a bunch of pleas from Max Reinhardt, the great stage and cinema director who was Jewish, and from Lotte Lehmann, the great soprano who had left Germany for political reasons. And they were writing to him or to friends of his, what's he going to do? In other words, if he withdraws, we're sort of going to have to withdraw too, because we would look bad if we don't. Toscanini's opinion became clear on the 16th of February. Quote, "The current political events in Austria oblige me to renounce my Salzburg Festival participation," he cabled Erwin Kerber, who was the director of both the Vienna State Opera and the Salzburg Festival. He sent a similar message to Salzburg's governor, Franz Rehrl, and issued an official statement through NBC that made the front pages of newspapers around the world the following morning. And this is, well, I won't read the whole thing, but owing to the unsettled conditions in Austria as reported in the American press this week, I have decided to abandon my plans to go to Salzburg for this year's music festival. In order to provide those in charge of the festival in Salzburg ample opportunity to make other arrangements, I have today telegraphed them of my decision. Excuse me. Talking too much. The benefit concert at Carnegie Hall, scheduled for March 4th, will be held as previously announced, except that the proceeds will go, etc. They were sent elsewhere. Now, many people, even those who agreed with Toscanini's political stand, excuse me, including his Jewish friends in Austria, told him, no, you're too quick. You've got to wait and see what happens. I don't want to read all of this because it's quite long, but even Bruno Walter wrote to him, saying, no, you should come back, you've got to help us, we have to save the festival, etc., etc. And he sent Toscanini a letter in which he said, I only want to ask this, wait, dearest friend, until the development of events can prove in clarity where Austria's course is going, and so on. But Toscanini had already answered Walter by cable. Futile to await your letter. My decision, however painful, is final. I have only one way of thinking and acting. I hate compromise. I walk, and I shall always walk on the straight path that I have traced for myself in life. And of course, 1 month later, the Austrians had the referendum in which they invited the Nazis into Austria, and the Anschluss took place. There were a lot of letters to Toscanini approving and not approving his decision. To me, the most moving was a letter that he received from Gaetano Salvemini, 20th-century Italy's most influential historian, who had escaped from Mussolini's regime, first to France and then to the United States, where he had joined the faculty of Harvard University. And this is a quote, translation from Salvemini's letter to Toscanini. In these Borgia-like years, you are the only person whose moral light remains steady amid the universal baseness, Salvemini wrote on 18 February. You are the only one who, at those important moments when we were lost in the darkness of despair, shouted words of faith, duty, and hope at us. Fate has not been so adverse today as may seem at first glance to be the case to those of us who have been scattered through the world by the tempest. To those cowards who bow down before the great beast, taking it to be Italy, we can teach that Italy is today represented not by Mussolini, but by Toscanini. May our Italy live forever, the Italy of, of Mazzini, which still continues through you, dear maestro, to speak to the world in terms worthy of its history and its nobility. On 2 March, the Salzburg Festival's administrators, apparently in a state of collective denial, cabled Toscanini to request that he communicate by the 10th of the month whether he had gone back on his decision. Otherwise, we are forced to consider your renunciation final. Toscanini replied, I am surprised by your insulting telegram, and I am surprised that the finality of my decision was not already understood from my first cable. So I'm going to end my readings there, and I'm going to invite up Stefano Albertini and Jonathan Rosenberg, and we will have a little discussion here, and also we can certainly accept questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harvey. You were worried that the passages would be too long, and I think many of us would have listened much longer, but then the book is there for that, because you read it in the intimacy of your own house. There are a couple of seats available now in the front row, because Professor Rosenberg and I moved up to the stage, so if you don't want to sit on the floor, please come. And I would like to ask Professor Rosenberg to start. Just push up the... Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to commend Harvey, first of all, for writing this book. We met a number of years ago, crossed paths just a couple of times in a library somewhere. It was in New York, I think.
Which is where we spend a lot of our
Yeah,
time.
it's true. And I actually reviewed the book for the Christian Science Monitor, and I tried to get triple rate because the book was so long, they wouldn't give it to me. I said, it's really like reading 3 books. But in all seriousness, one of the things I think that does bear emphasizing is the extent to which this book is more than a book about perhaps the greatest conductor of the 20th century, which most people, or many people, not all, many people think Toscanini was. It really is a book about the 20th century, broadly speaking, or at least the first half of it, and the great events and developments of the 20th century in which Toscanini's life was entangled. And for me, while I'm certainly interested in music, in fact, I was a musician, and I found the aspects of the book, the musical aspects, compelling. What I found truly memorable, and I think all of you will too, is the extent to which Toscanini he operated on the world stage, not merely on the concert stage. And this was a man who, and we got a little, in that third excerpt, I think we got a taste of that, over many decades stood at the center of, epical events of the 20th century. The emergence of the First World War, the emergence of fascism, the Second World War, and stood on the world stage boldly in a way that, in reading the book, and I know a fair bit about Toscanini to begin with, I've done a lot of research on him, but it's just one marvels at the stand this man took. Not only is he conducting all throughout Europe and in the United States, but he is engaged in extraordinarily important events, the great events of the 20th century, and takes a stand, a noble stand, repeatedly, sometimes risking his life to do so. In 1931, and that I think there's something tremendously ennobling about it. I think he is in that way a rather heroic figure, and I think that among the important questions that this book raises, and it raises many, is the role of the artist in society. This was a man who was not content to perform the Beethoven symphonies brilliantly, or Brahms, or Wagner, or Strauss. He was a man who engaged on the world stage, challenging Hitler, for example, challenging Mussolini. The famous, in 1933, when he writes the letter, challenging Hitler, stepping away from Bayreuth, stepping away from Salzburg, going to Palestine in the late 1930s. It really is quite remarkable, and You mentioned in passing something that I do think is interesting for those who don't spend their time reading old newspapers. What's very interesting, or one of the things that's quite interesting, is when you read newspapers, say from the 30s and 40s, Toscanini's name and stories about him appear not merely in the music section of the newspaper; they appear on the front page of the newspaper. Newspapers all over the United States. He was a person who was known as much for his musical activities and also for his global engagement. And I think that's something that should not be lost on us as we sit here and reflect on him and reflect on his significance.
I think it's also important to note that he did this because he felt that music and politics should be separate. This sounds like a paradox, but in fact, his idea was these people, these non-garden variety politicians, the fascists and the Nazis, are trying to make art a tool of their propaganda. And his feeling about that was that this was a criminal act. He was not a politician. He was not interested in day-to-day politics in that sense, although he certainly was an extremely liberal thinker, and at times radical, I would say. But he wasn't interested in day-to-day politics. He simply realized that you can't work in a situation like that where you have to put up with racism, other forms of oppression. So that was his way of reacting to it. He never wanted to be involved in politics, but he became a symbol of nonpartisan opposition to oppression, to political oppression.
Yes, I just want to follow up on this, and the letter of Salvemini is really moving. It's a beautiful piece, and knowing that they shared this destiny of having to leave Italy because of the dictatorship. And what I found particularly moving is that there is that reference to Mazzini, and it establishes an ideal line of continuity between Mazzini, who is the great thinker that really conceived the unification of Italy, even if it happened under a king, and Mazzini was a very fervent Republican. And reading your book, I discovered that Toscanini came from a line of Mazziniani. His great-grandfather was a soldier with Garibaldi. His father was a soldier with Garibaldi, and that's where he had his moment of glory. Then he was a terrible businessman, but he was a very idealistic patriot who firmly believed in the Republican ideals of Mazzini. I think there was no way for Salvemini to know the detail about Toscanini family. That's why I found it even more moving. So these are probably the values that he breathed in his household, that he lived with. And even if it never became like a main part of his existence, or probably not even a very important part of his existence, he lived his life faithful to these ideals. So I thought it was brilliant, this mention of Mazzini, and that this figure that comes back again and again, and probably a name that he heard when he was a little boy from his father. What else do we know about his political convictions? He was definitely anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, in a pretty radical way. Do we know anything else about his persuasions? How would you define him? He was not a communist either.
In 1919, when Mussolini, who had been kicked out of the Socialist Party because he had been for Italy's entry into the war, and the Socialist Party was officially pacifist. In 1919, when Mussolini formed a new party that was extreme left, to the left of the Socialist Party. That was the one time in Toscanini's life when he joined a party. Now the program, the platform of this new party, which wasn't yet called the Fascist Party, was Bolshevik, essentially. It was, abolition of the banks, abolition of the stock exchange, universal suffrage for women, men, you know, the whole thing, that there would be a national constituent assembly that would be part of an international constituent assembly, et cetera, et cetera. It was an extremely radical platform, and Toscanini supported it, and even against his will became a candidate in the 1919 elections. Of course, the party was totally squashed and defeated, and Mussolini at that point, being much more a politician than a man of principle, decided, well, if I can't win to the extreme left, I'm going to go to the extreme right. And by 1922, when the March on Rome took place, Toscanini had told Eugenio Balzan of the Corriere della Sera, if I were capable of killing a man, I would kill Mussolini. But as far as beyond that, and he says in one of his letters to one of his many girlfriends, Toscanini says, you know, I have never participated in politics as such, except that one time, which I'm now ashamed of because of what happened afterwards with Mussolini. The only thing I can tell you is that after the war, Vali Toscanini, his daughter, told me that he always voted for the Social Democrats. You know, that's all I know about his actual political, and of course he was totally anti-monarchic. He hated the church. He hated the monarchy. He said that he was not an atheist. He believed in some sort of, you know, a pantheistic God somewhere out there, but he did not agree. He hated the church. He was totally, when he returned to Italy in '46 at the end of the war, after his 8 years of exile here, one of the reasons why he returned, apart from reopening La Scala, which was the main reason, was to vote in the referendum that made Italy a republic and eliminated the monarchy.
And another thing that also has to do with this, of course, and with the title of your book, that his faithfulness to his principles, and even more than that, to his conscience, comes up throughout the book, even from a very early age. And it's not only political. Like that episode that you recount, that in boarding school, in the Conservatorio, at some point he decided he's not going to go to Mass anymore. And there were sanctions, and they were enforced, and nothing helped like making him change his mind. I mean, he was like 15 or 16, and it would have been very easy for any boy that age, you know, okay, I'm going to sit through it, think of something else, and get out. And same thing when Giulio Ricordi writes an opera. And at first, Toscanini says, okay, I'm going to play that. And then he reads it, and he realizes that it's terrible. And Giulio Ricordi, as it has been remembered, was the superpower in the Italian publishing industry. He could do and undo the fortunes of composers, conductors, and singers. And at this point, Toscanini was very young. So he was already at the Scala, but you know, he was very fragile on that podium. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it. He saves his face, saying it's, because we didn't have enough time to rehearse it, but it's very obvious, and Giulio Ricordi was smart enough to understand that there was a problem with it. And actually, he started a campaign against him. So, I mean, he could have been doomed by this choice. So if it's a fidelity, that's another great trait of his personality. It's a fidelity to his consciousness, to the things he believes are right, deeply inside himself, whether it's like religious convictions, whether a piece of music is worth performing or not, or political convictions. That's really the common thread throughout his life, and probably, you know, now we celebrate him because he was a musical genius and because he changed the way of conducting. But from a human point of view, I think this is a remarkable and very, very rare feature. And as a non-musician, that is also something that strikes me enormously about this character.
Yes, this is absolutely correct. He was, as he says when he talks about his early, you know, the cello exam, you know, I felt I couldn't play the piece well enough. So I told my teacher, no, I don't play it well enough. I'm not going to play it on the exam. this is the way he was through his whole existence. And of course, he made life very difficult for many people as a result of this. This was not an easy person to get along with. Although, generally speaking, in the family, he was an relatively easygoing parent and grandparent. But in many of his relationships, he was extremely difficult because he had this way of thinking and things had to go that way, and that was it. The same thing as an interpreter. If you listen, even though we only have recordings from basically the last quarter to a third of his long, long career, you hear huge changes in his interpretations. They tended to be much more flexible in the earlier recordings and more taut and hard-driven in the later ones. Nevertheless, at any given moment, this was the way the piece had to go. And you were going to do it that way, or, I'm going to die in the attempt to get you to do it that way. So, these are not easy people to live with necessarily, especially professionally, but that's the way he was.
Yeah, one of the things picking up on that I found interesting in the book and also from other reading I've done on Toscanini is he was a tough conductor to play under. But, and he was a taskmaster, he made demands of people, but the musicians nevertheless loved and revered him. There may be a few exceptions, but on the whole, they respected deeply his knowledge of music, his commitment to music, this kind of unyielding quality that he had, and as tough as he might have made it on a day-to-day basis in a rehearsal, and there are the tapes of all that kind of stuff, they really loved this man. My little personal anecdote, in another lifetime, I was a trumpet player. I went to music school, and in those days I was not particularly interested in the history of music or much else other than practicing the trumpet. And I asked my trumpet teacher, a rather legendary person in his own right, a man named William Vacchiano, who played under Toscanini. I said, who was the greatest conductor you ever played under? And he said, Toscanini. He said, he was tough, but we loved him. And that's what it was. He was a tough man to play under, but the musicians respected him because, in a certain sense, they understood he demanded as much of himself as he did of them. And that is not always the case with conductors.
Right. Also, he was a very generous person. Gianandrea Gavazzeni, who was a well-known conductor of the following generation, whom I had the privilege of knowing quite well, told me that in the 20s, when Toscanini conducted the Scala ensemble, in those days, the orchestra unions were just in their infancy, and players were not paid on a year-round basis. They were paid per week of services that they performed and so on, and not well. And he said that towards the end of each month, you would see a lineup of musicians outside Toscanini's home in Via Durini in Milan, and they would go to Carla, Toscanini's wife, and ask for a loan, quote unquote, and she had orders from her husband, you give them whatever they need, because he understood. He was well paid for his work, and they were not so well paid, and so he felt, this is repeatedly in the recounting of musicians who worked with him, singers and so on. He could be terrifying on the podium, but the minute he stepped away from the podium, he was very sweet. And there was one incident, I always think of this one particular incident when he went to Palestine, by the way, at his own expense in 1936 to conduct the inaugural concerts of what is now the Israel Philharmonic, to show his solidarity with the Jewish musicians who were fleeing from Germany. One performance of the Brahms Second Symphony.
I know that. Go ahead. Yeah,
Speaking of trumpets.
I'm
Speaking
recalling
of
this story
trumpets.
from the book. Yeah.
So the third movement of the Brahms Second, the trumpet, it says, tacet, silent, don't play here. but the trumpet player had lost his concentration. Of course, the last movement, the fourth movement, begins with one note that the trumpet plays with the strings of the orchestra. And the trumpet played that note at the beginning of the third movement. And Toscanini, this was in a concert. And usually, whatever happened in a concert, he was impassive. At rehearsal, he would lose his temper. But he was so furious because this was so clearly a mistake, and a mistake that was due to lack of concentration, which is what always bothered him. A bad note in a rehearsal, just let it pass. He was livid through the rest of the performance. And the poor trumpet player was afraid what was going to happen to him. The next morning, he went into the rehearsal with his tail between his legs, and he went to Toscanini's dressing room, trembling. And Toscanini smiled at him and said, it's okay, and he gave him an autographed photo of himself. So, it was over. Once it was over, it was over. But when it actually happened, it was terrible.
And now we, of course, at the element, also because of the interest of Professor Rosenberg's, the first topic we touched upon was politics and personality and the relationship between art and artists and society. But, definitely we're here to celebrate a great musical genius, and we don't use this word lightly, and in the case, probably, it's one of the few cases in which we are authorized to use it. But if you had to summarize the reasons why we celebrate today Toscanini, recognize him, I would say not everybody, but many, probably most people recognize him as the greatest director of the 20th century. What would be the things that made him so unique and that gave him the stature that he still has now?
Well, in a way, that's a complicated question, because why he's remembered today is because he was the first conductor, the oldest conductor. I mean, this is somebody who was born in 1867. This year was his 150th birthday. He was the first conductor to have a really substantial chunk of his repertoire, or at least his symphonic repertoire, recorded. So we have evidence of his recordings. Now, a lot of the recordings, in my opinion, don't show him at his best. Nevertheless, we have a substantial chunk of recordings of his repertoire. That's one of the reasons. The reason that fewer people know about, but that really, in a way, we could say is the most important aspect, is that he was a tremendous reformer in the concert hall and in the opera house. So, in Toscanini's youth, operas were, well, first of all, just think, La Scala did not have an orchestra pit until 1907, when Toscanini had already been conducting there for nearly a decade. The orchestra still played at ground floor level, and that was fine for 18th century operas and early 19th century operas. But when you start doing late Verdi, Wagner, Richard Strauss, Debussy, I mean, the orchestra had to play at 1/3 or 1/4 the dynamic level that was indicated in the score in order not to drown out the singers. So he insisted on installing an orchestra pit. He insisted on installing a laterally opening curtain. Before that, they had painted front drops with mythological paintings on them. And the curtain would, the front drop would come down, cutting off first the singers' heads and then gradually the rest of their, and going up in the opposite direction. So all this sort of thing. I mean, when you read the newspaper reports from the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, 1900, he did a production of Tristan in Milan, which incidentally was the local premiere of Tristan und Isolde 35 years after the world premiere. All the German theater directors came to the performance, including Wagner's son, Siegfried Wagner, because Toscanini had had a new lighting system installed at La Scala that was revolutionary in its day. And they all wanted to see how it operated. They went away amazed by the level of the performance, which Siegfried Wagner said no orchestra in Germany performs as well as this one does, even though they're singing the opera in Italian. All of these reforms, the insistence on unity in the performance of opera, that the staging, the orchestra, the solo singers, the chorus, everything had to be prepared in a unified way so that a production made sense theatrically as well as musically. He insisted on this, and this is where this terrible temper developed, because in order to do something like that in a limited amount of time, you had to be a lion tamer. It was not a question of, could you please, it's this way, it's going to be this way, and that's it. And the same thing with the standards in the orchestras, especially in Italy. There were no permanent orchestras in Italy in the late 19th century. They were rehired for the opera houses at the beginning of every season. And this is what he insisted on. They had to play properly. They were not going to sit there fighting over who plays first stand and who plays second stand and who plays third stand in the violin section, which happened all the time. No, this is the way things are going to go, and you'd better behave or you're out. And, later on, he never fired musicians. He hated firing musicians because he felt they depend on this for their income and for their living, and he would make people's lives miserable rather than fire them, but he wouldn't fire them. But early on, when there was this constant rotation anyway, if you didn't play well, if you came to rehearsals or didn't show up for rehearsals, you were out, and that was it. So it was this reformist that was really the essence, I would say, of the legend of Toscanini.
And following up on this, in his conducting style, something else I discovered reading your book is that there was this fundamental idea that led him in his profession to give a performance that would be as close as possible to the will and the concept that the composer put down on the score, minding that he knew all the scores by heart, didn't have them in front of him. So that's already another element, of his prodigious memory. But the whole idea that singers performed, added notes, put little coda, did some parts super slow. So it was really more of a show-off case for their virtuosismo rather than performing the opera as it was composed. And I think it's an episode that you recount about him meeting Mascagni, that was conducting his own opera, in which the singers were doing whatever the hell they wanted, and Mascagni begged Toscanini to direct his opera so that singers would do what he wrote on the score. So there was this paradox, but I think that's a great story, but it really also says a lot about something that now we take more or less for granted, that singers and musicians are supposed to do what is on the score, written on the score. I mean, he really reestablished what seems like now like a normal basic principle of contemporary execution. So you might want to say something about that, and while we're at it, tell us something about his relationship with the composers that he met and that he directed when they were still alive. So Puccini, Mascagni himself, Verdi, and so on.
So this too was a very complicated question because I remember talking about this with conductor Erich Leinsdorf many years ago, and talking about the idea of objectivity and subjectivity in musical performance. And Leinsdorf said, there is no such thing as objectivity because a score cannot play itself. And he said the difference is between a performer who wants to try to figure out what there is in a score and someone who simply wants to take the score as something to improve upon or use as something for showing his or her own way of thinking about music. The difference is, Leinsdorf said, if you go into the Louvre and somebody's painted a mustache on the Mona Lisa, everybody realizes that this is a terrible distortion. But a lot of conductors paint mustaches on the Brahms symphonies and nobody knows the difference. And I think that this is what Toscanini was trying to do. And of course, he was not alone. There were a lot of very responsible and gifted musicians. His idea was, and he said this in a letter, was to come as close as possible to expressing the ideas of the composer. He felt he never managed to do that, but that was his lifelong struggle, was to try to do that. And I think every serious musician feels that deep down. You try. Every time you perform a piece, you try, you try, you try. And of course, the possibilities are infinite, because we know also from recordings that composers do of their own works. If they do them twice, they're different. So, but his idea was, you do everything you can to help the composer express him or herself, right, as well as possible. He knew Verdi, not well, and in one of the conversation tapes he says, "I wish I were older. I wish I had been born sooner so I could have known Verdi better." He knew Verdi from the rehearsals of Otello, and he always referred to those rehearsals. Throughout his career, he would tell orchestras, Verdi they rehearsed the singers, the staging, the chorus, the orchestra separately so thoroughly, and this was with Franco Faccio conducting, that when we came to the first ensemble rehearsal, we went right through each act. And he said, I always tried to do that. He said, when I did the Italian premiere of Salome, which of course was a radical and incredibly difficult opera in its day, this was in 1906, the Italian premiere, he said, Puccini came to the first ensemble rehearsal, and he said, how many ensemble rehearsals have you had? I said, this is the first one. He said, it's perfect, because we worked out every detail first. So, but he talks about Verdi, he talks about, in the conversation tapes, he even talks about how Verdi looked. He said there's phosphorescenza in his eyes, this phosphorescence. And he talks about Catalani, who was apparently a tremendous character. He talks about Puccini, not always in the most positive terms. There was great rivalry, not musical rivalry, because Toscanini never considered himself a creative person. But he had his serious doubts about Puccini, even though he conducted the world premieres of 3 of Puccini's operas, La Bohème, Fanciulla del West, and Turandot, which, by the way, he pronounces in the tapes Turandot without the final T. Pronounces French style, and apparently Puccini did also. Anyway, he was very close. He talks about Leoncavallo, because when Toscanini was 25 years old, he conducted the world premiere of Pagliacci. And he talks about how at the first performance we did it all in 1 act, and then we realized that it had to be done in 2 acts. You had to bring the curtain down after Vesti la Giubba, and then we told Leoncavallo you should write an intermezzo in between. These were the days when this was an active world. Things were happening. The opera was big business also at that time. And, he talks about his encounters with Debussy, with Richard Strauss, whom he disliked as a person because Richard Strauss was too interested in money for Toscanini's taste, etc. It's fascinating to listen to these conversations, and I've tried to distill into the book the most important bits, anyway, of his opinions there.
Professor Rosenberg, do you have a
Yeah, I thought, wouldn't we be remiss if we did not say something about an aspect of Toscanini's character, he was quite a womanizer. He was quite a womanizer. And that is an important theme in the book. Perhaps you don't wish to discuss it here, but people might be interested to know that. I mean, it is something that for me, I mean, I had some vague sense of it beforehand, but after reading this, it really strikes me as essential to who he was. One should probably at least doff our cap to it.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Toscanini was the typical 19th century Latin male, you know, mother, wife, and daughters on a pedestal, but the minute the wife went around the corner, you could do whatever you wanted to do, and he did. And he
wrote about it in his
and he wrote tons of letters that after a while could have been mimeographed. I mean, it was, you know, change the name but send sort of the same thing to... I mean, there were some affairs that were serious. I think with Rosina Storchio, the soprano, with whom he had a child in 1903. There was this Ada Mainardi. He had a long affair with her in the 1930s. Perhaps one or two others along the way, but there were a lot of one-night stands and or 10-night stands or whatever. And
that's what's impressive.
And he wrote letters. He wrote letters, and he wrote letters, and he wrote letters, and Lotte Lehmann, and you know. But you also have to take into consideration that the theater world, in some ways, is like the circus world. You know, there's a lot of bed hopping that goes on. And he took full advantage of it. He was a good-looking guy and very famous, and he didn't hold back. He also believed, you know, there was this Dr. Murri who had a theory that women, you know, didn't really count, but a man should have at least one orgasm a day in order to stay healthy and live long. And, you know...
Maybe Dr. Murri was right.
And Dr. Murri lived into his 90s, and so, you know... So, you know, Toscanini, he did his best. What can I tell you?
Follow the doctor's orders, yeah, exactly.
And this very much in the style of Puccini. That
Puccini
also
also...
infinite number of more regular lovers and then more irregular lovers. And
Right. And Verdi, we think also, probably, with Teresa Stolz and so on and so forth. So, you know, as I say, the theater world is like the world of the circus, in that sense, anyway.
I think these opens up to the audience if you have any question for...
I just want to mention, before we do that, we are going to show about 15 minutes of a film that was made during the war. So I don't know how much time we have.
5-7 minutes for questions and
Okay,
answers, and then
sure.
we roll the...
Just I wanted to,
Yeah.
you know, as a trombone player, they told me that, I think it was La Boheme, that the composer Puccini went to Toscanini and said, what should I put here? And Toscanini came up with these trombone chords that were there, and supposedly the score remained that way. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know.
Can you repeat the question for the recording and the live stream?
Okay, yes. The question is about did Toscanini add trombone chords in the score of La Boheme, which he conducted the world premiere of in 1896 when he was 29 years old. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that Puccini constantly asked Toscanini for advice about orchestration. And in particular, in the case of The Girl of the Golden West, La Fanciulla del West, 1910, there is one Italian musicologist who calls it a four-hand opera because Toscanini made so many suggestions in the orchestration of the piece that really changed the timbre, the tone of the orchestration. Puccini was afraid of Toscanini, his musical opinions. He really was. And Toscanini talks at length about Butterfly and how Puccini, this was the one case where Puccini, instead of playing through the opera for him, just played a little bit and then handed him the score because he was afraid that Toscanini wouldn't like it. And Toscanini said, when I read, because the original version was in only 2 acts, with an incredibly long first act, he said, when I read the score, I felt Puccini has lost his way here. And of course, the premiere was a disaster. It was one of the great scandals in La Scala's history. Toscanini did not conduct the premiere of that. He was, at that time, on the outs with La Scala in 1904. But he did then conduct the second version, or the third version, of the score. And, Puccini also, you may be interested to know that in Tosca, those of you who know Tosca well, the bells that ring at the beginning of the third act, the Roman Campagna and so on, Puccini and Toscanini had been playing through the score together, Toscanini at the piano, Puccini at the harmonium in Puccini's home. And at one point, Toscanini started adding these chime-type sounds, and Puccini said, "That's great," and those are still in the score. So, it's, as I say, this was a time when opera was a living organism, and operas were being produced constantly and listened to constantly. People were interested in new works. They didn't want to hear old works. They wanted to hear new compositions. And so there was this constant contact between composer and performer. And, the same thing with the singers. Can you sing this part that I've written for you? Well, if you can't, I'll rewrite it because I don't want to write something that's going to come out sounding terrible. It was a living thing.
Yes.
One more?
So when you say he had a happy marriage, if he was such a womanizer, she must have known about it. But some men can still make their wife happy and service them.
Am I repeating the question?
Do you know what their marriage was like?
The question is whether Toscanini had a happy marriage despite all his womanizing. Well, I would say yes and no. I think that he was, in his way, very devoted to his wife. There was one point when she threatened to leave him after the third of their 4 children died at the age of not quite 5, died of diphtheria when they were in Buenos Aires. Toscanini was conducting there. And she was so tired she was distraught over the death, so was he, over the death of their son. And she was so sick of his philandering that she said, "I'm packing my trunks and I'm going back. I'm taking the next ship back to Italy." And he persuaded her to stay. And they then had their 4th child, Wanda, the one who married Vladimir Horowitz. And Vali, the older sister, said to me, this is why my sister came out so badly, because she was born in anger and not in love. She was conceived in anger and not in love. Well, this is not a very scientific opinion, but I think Carla sort of resigned herself at a certain point, and she would play tricks on him as well. For his 70th birthday, she arranged a birthday party for him, and at his table at their home in Via Durini, she set up a lot of his old girlfriends. And he told Margherita Wallmann, who was one of his then current lovers, he said...
At age 70. Yeah,
he was 70 and Margherita was 30-something. He told her, "If I had had all these women, when would I have had time to work? I did all that work, you know, but he did his part, as I said. Okay.
So definitely Carla had a sense of humor.
She had a sense of humor, and you know, at the end, he was very sweet to her when she died several years before he did, even though she was 10 years younger. And when she was dying, he was very sweet to her. He stayed by her bedside all the time. She had heart problems, and you know, he told her very, very nice things and so on. And when he went away, she said to her daughter, "He's always been a big liar." So she knew.
One of the very sad things in the book, I haven't finished it. I read the first 300 pages in 2 days. But
Wow. There will be a medal. You'll get a medal, I think so.
is the, and I don't know how something like this is verified, but that the fact that after they had the last child, they had no further intimate relationship. And, okay, so that could be a decision that the two of them make. That's fine.
We don't know who made that decision, right?
This idea of the Italian thinking that he would not allow divorce, because although he was anti-clerical and he was an atheist or whatever he was, you know, the man has to be allowed his space, and the woman has to accept it, and you know, he wouldn't allow it because it's a I don't know what the term he used was. He didn't say sacrament, but it's something.
No. Right.
I mean, unfortunately, you know, we see that. But one more thing. Milano, the La Scala Museum has this wonderful photographic museum exhibit right now, Toscanini. And I just took it all in. Couldn't wait to get back and buy your book. And lastly, I taught for 1 year at the Arturo Toscanini Junior High School in the Bronx.
Oh.
Anybody know?
I know that it exists. I knew that it existed. So the basic question here is about the fact that he did not allow divorce. Well, the real fact is that divorce was not legal in Italy until 1975. So had Carla left in 1906, which is when she threatened to leave him, you know, they could have been separated, or they could have gotten a divorce somewhere else, I suppose, but it was not possible to be divorced in Italy. You could get an annulment through the church, but they had 3 children, so you know, it would have been difficult to do that. He was against divorce, and he says in one of his letters to one of his lovers, "I know that this is stupid, but I can't help it. I was born, I grew up with this idea, a man has one father, one mother, one wife, and that's it." And that was the old-fashioned side of Toscanini. You know, she, as I say, she put up with it, and she did live a pretty rich life, actually, and apart from that. So, I guess we want to.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, Harvey, first, congratulations on your
Thank you.
great achievement. I haven't read your book yet, but I will. And you did meet some of the performers who played under him. This trumpet player who came trembling and so forth. Well, I knew 2 musicians who were in the NBC orchestra. One was Michel Nazi. He was the first oboist. And the other was Robert Lamarquina, who was 16 and played first cellist.
And became a conductor, didn't he? Also, Robert
Yes,
Lamarquina.
he was.
Yeah.
He became a conductor. Died quite recently. They told me, of course, they all revered him, as everybody knows. Everyone revered him because of his musicality and his adherence to the score. But he was tyrannical to the nth degree. They were, while they respected him, they were scared to death of while they were performing, they were scared to death that he would be displeased with them. I have a question. basis of the recordings?
Okay, first of all, this is Seymour Bernstein who was asked this question. Many of you have probably seen the film that Ethan Hawke made about Seymour as a great piano teacher, great musician in the New York area, and we're very honored to have him here with us. The question is, do we hear the tyranny of Toscanini, who could be very brutal with the musicians, not physically brutal, but emotionally brutal, in the recordings? I personally don't. I hear in many of the later recordings a certain rigidity that I think was more due to, you know, with some conductors who work well into their later years, what you got this with Klemperer, you got it with several other older conductors, you get a sort of slowing down and spreading out of the tempo. With Toscanini, I think he was so determined not to be an old conductor that in some of the performances he tends to push the tempo. I personally don't feel emotional tyranny in the performances, but you know, I'm not saying that necessarily doesn't exist. You know, I spoke with probably, I would guess, over the years, at least 60 or 70 orchestra musicians who worked with him in the Philharmonic, in the NBC Symphony, at La Scala, and so on. And the overwhelming majority expressed the sort of love and appreciation of him. And they all said, yeah, he was tough. He was a tough guy to work under, but he was tougher on himself. And you hear, actually, there are rehearsals. I think particularly there's a rehearsal of Toscanini at, I think, 84, rehearsing Elgar's Enigma variations. And at one point, he gives a wrong cue. And the clarinet comes in exactly right. And Toscanini stops and says, "Bravo clarinetto, stupido io, vecchio." You know, and he did. There is a photo of him smacking himself on the head when he would make a mistake, and he did make mistakes. You know, so it's a mixed bag. Of course, no conductor today could behave the way he did, screaming and shouting when things went wrong. On the other hand, Carlo Maria Giulini, who was the opposite, a very gentle soul conductor, said to me, "Do you know why we don't scream at orchestras today? It's because he did that for us a long time ago. He created the circumstances in which we don't have to do that, because there is a basic discipline in professional orchestra playing today that is understood, you know. So it works both ways, you know. Anyway.
Isn't it a great lesson to learn today for all teachers?
I would say.
No matter how gifted you are, no matter how you're devoted to your art, tyranny is absolutely forbidden in dealing with your pupils or with the musicians of an orchestra. Where Toscanini to Michel Nazi, the oboist, said to him, "You're an asino." Well, that's absolutely forbidden. And it's inexcusable. And in my instance, I hear it in the music. I hear it in the recording. There's a certain fear, a certain holding back for fear of doing the wrong thing. It's not a completely emotional, satisfying experience for my taste. So I was interested to know if your colleagues feel the same way.
Unfortunately, I'm not a musician. I just teach Italian literature. But my understanding, and I actually asked myself the same question while I was reading the book. I said, these men, that we all revere for his anti-tyrannical stance. Basically, his big enemy was the tyrant, whether it was Mussolini, Hitler, the king, the emperor. And then in his own profession, he was considered somehow. So it puzzled me, this idea. And then, I came to the realization that there are certain jobs for which democracy does not apply. And conducting an orchestra is one of those. And probably you know better than I do. And, and I was thinking same thing in a surgical room. The head surgeon cannot consult 15 people and ask, okay, raise your hands. Should we proceed here? Cut here? So as much as we all revere democracy and of course are convinced that it's the best possible way of ruling people, in some professions it simply doesn't work, and Toscanini is a living proof of that. This from a non-musician perspective.
Yeah, I would just say I don't hear that in the performances. What I do hear right the way through, because over the period of time that he was recording, you do hear an intensity. Now maybe that's what I mean, there is intensity in those performances, particularly with the NBC, that is yeah. Okay, I'm not sure I'd use the word rigidity. Harvey, I defer to Harvey on this, though. I mean, he has listened to this stuff, probably more than anyone. There is this extraordinary intensity. I can appreciate the fact that for you, that you find that off-putting and you read that or interpret that as a function of this kind of tyrannical quality. I myself don't. I think listening to recordings and trying to express our thoughts on them, it's interesting and so extraordinarily subjective. I think it is, I appreciate that, and I will do my best to listen for that when I listen to Toscanini in the future. As I've listened over the years to his recordings, I don't hear it that way.
But on the other hand, it's like